Yo, what is up guys, it's Ghost here, welcome back to another video. Today I've got a bit of a Stormgate news roundup for you guys. There's quite a few things happened over the past couple of weeks that I just wanted to clue you in on. So first of all, Tim Morton, one of the owners of Frost Giant Studios, he has sort of opened up about some of the development struggles that the game has had and also given us some clue as to what their plans are going into the future. We've also got update 0.2 dropping fairly soon for Stormgate, and then there is going to be a new AMA or an Ask Me Anything over on Reddit where me and you will have the opportunity to ask Frost Giant Games, the developers of Stormgate, anything that we want. The question is, will they answer it or not? I suppose that remains to be seen. So all that and more is coming up. If you want to stay up to date with everything Stormgate, Battle Aces, Zero Space, RTS games in general, make sure you are subbed to the channel because there will be plenty more content to come here in the future, and I'll be keeping an eye on all of those titles. So to kick things off here, Jax, one of the community managers, she took to the Discord and she says here, mark your calendars, Stormgate Update 0.2 featuring an early playable version of a new Vanguard co-op hero will be released on December the 19th, and then we invite you to join us on December the 20th for a Stormgate AMA with members of the Frost Giant dev team. More details to come. So both of those things are pretty exciting. What is going to be in update 0.2, I hear you cry? Well, this is the updated roadmap here. So we've got more Team Mayhem testing. I know this testing has been underway with a closed group of players. No idea how that's going. I'm not in there myself. And even if I was, I don't think I'd be able to say anything about it because it's under NDA. But that's going to continue. There's going to be a new Vanguard hero, and then we're going to see improvements to the gear system, more art improvements, audio improvements, performance optimizations, and then AI improvements as well. So nothing like too crazy. It's not like they're dropping a bunch of new chapters for the Vanguard campaign or anything like that, but just making some improvements to the game, getting it a little bit closer to where they want it to be for the 1.0 release, which I think we can all agree on is definitely a good thing. So I don't think it's going to be like the patch that brings everybody back to the game and the player bases are going to massively increase, but it's definitely a solid step in the right direction, and that's always good to see. Truth be told, I am far more interested and excited for the AMA. As most of us know who frequent the Discord and the subreddit, Frost Giant Games have kind of had their heads down, understandably so, working on the game. They haven't been communicating with us so much if you compare it to when, like, before the game released. And that's both with the community in general and also with content creators such as myself. There have been a couple of, they call them summits, that we've been invited to where they go over the plan for the game, the current release cadence, the release schedule, and there hasn't been one of those for quite some time. So, you know, they haven't just been keeping you guys in the dark. Like, I know literally nothing about the future of the game right now, so I'm in the exact same boat as you guys. And so I have a lot of questions that I want to ask them. I know the community at large will. What is the plan for the game? How are they financing things going forward? Since obviously they're not getting any revenue from the game itself being in early access, right? Because we all know that the player base is pretty dire at the moment. And just in general, like, what is their plan moving forward? I feel like we're all somewhat in the same boat. We want to support the game, but at the same time, we're somewhat skeptical on whether or not they're even going to make it to a 1.0 release. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom about it. I tend to try to be more positive about these things, but I'm not going to lie, it's definitely been something that's on my mind when it comes to keeping this channel going, right? Like, if the game dies, then obviously my channel kind of dies as well. So yeah, I'm quite invested in this here, and I really hope to hear some good, positive, encouraging answers from the Frost Giant team. And if you want to submit some questions of your own, Gerald also chimed in here, and he says we'll have a thread for pre-submitting questions like we've had in past AMAs. Ask whatever you like, though there will obviously be some things that we can't answer as our crystal balls still haven't been delivered by Amazon. I would not be surprised if they are reluctant to answer anything to do with revenue, how they're backing the game. Maybe they are obliged to answer that sort of stuff. I'm not really sure how that works, whether they have to be transparent with us on that sort of information there. But obviously there was that whole debacle about them saying the game was fully funded to release. They were talking about the early access release. We all thought they were talking about the 1.0 release, and then that turned out to be the early access, and that kind of blew up in their face. So I don't know, maybe they want to keep that sort of information to themselves. But on the flip side, I think we also would like to know that information so we can kind of rest easy knowing that hopefully the game is now funded to 1.0. And then as a little additional comment here, Gerald also says, please keep expectations in check for 0.2. This is not our 1.0 release. We want to show you steady improvement, but we still have a long road ahead. So once again, just reiterating that there are going to be some great changes in 0.2. But like I said, this is not going to be like the whoop-de-doo, the game's fixed patch. It's going to be solid. It's going to be a step in the right direction, but it's not necessarily something that's going to make everybody reinstall the game again. Okay, moving on, let's talk a little bit about a recent lecture that Tim Morton actually gave over in, I believe it was India, and the lecture is entitled Lessons from Launching via Steam Early Access. And we can actually extract quite a few interesting tidbits and gain a bit of insight into Stormgate from this lecture, so I have cherry-picked a few interesting bits from the lecture. It is 46 minutes long, the entire thing, so I'll link it down in the description if you haven't watched it already. But I just want to highlight some of the interesting things that Tim had to say here.
It is meant to be a lower consumer expectation than full launch. So clearly, beta as a designation, early access as a designation, broadcasts that there is still work to do on this game. And so our hope as developers is that players will be forgiving, which I'll get into a little bit later.
So here he's talking about the fact that Stormgate, and indeed an open beta, is essentially an early monetized version of the game, and whilst they try to market the game as an unfinished product and keep the community's expectations in check, that has largely failed. I think he's realized now, and the entire team have over at FrostGen Games, that what people want is a polished, finished experience. It doesn't matter how many times you tell people, hey guys, this isn't ready, don't be too harsh with your critique. People just want to play finished products. Why would you want to play a game that's half-baked and unfinished when there are literally thousands of the fantastic games out there that you can play that are all completed? It's kind of weird because we all jump in there knowing that it's unfinished. At least I did, right? I backed the game, and I have no qualms about the fact that I have to wait until the 1.0 release and that the game is going to be better. But I think it just goes to show there are so many players out there who either don't get it or just don't really care. They just want to have their cake and eat it now.
One of the things that Valve does to offset the fact that the game isn't done yet is it treats reviews differently during the early access period than after the full launch. So in a sense, you get a second swing at reviews later, but early access reviews do still matter, and they are still kept historically.
So that is something quite interesting to me. I didn't actually know that you kind of get a second swing at reviews, that when you have your 1.0 release, I don't think Steam exactly hits the reset button on the reviews, but maybe sort of meets you halfway, At the moment, Stormgate is sitting at 49% overall positive reviews, but actually recent reviews in the last 30 days are only at 43%, which I find strange because the game is improving. They're putting out patches that I think we're all happy with, so surely the recent review score should be higher than the old reviews. Maybe that's just because a lot of people who are actually super stoked for the game, like me for example, maybe when the game came out we all gave our positive reviews right at the start, and now more and more players who are finding the game and coming in are leading to a higher number of negative reviews coming out of that portion of the user base. But that's good news. Hopefully, once 1.0 releases, the game is going to be judged on its own merit again at that time, and the bad reviews that it got early access aren't going to shine a bad light on it.
These are all some great games. This is to take nothing away from these games or these teams, but much like Stormgate, these games, when they launched, had a mixed reception. Palia actually launched off Steam first, but came later. But Nightingale, Pax Day, Spectre, Spectre Divide are all there on Steam. And the truth is, players want polished content. And as much as we try to disclaim that something is not a 1.0 launch yet by designating it early access, players really want polished content. And so if you look at the titles that succeed, that really do break out during early access, things like Helldivers 2, Hades 2, Palworld, Manor Lords, these titles generally have either a player fantasy that is really unique, like Palworld, or a high degree of polish, like Hades 2. I think titles like these titles, or like Stormgate, that are broad in scope, but don't have the degree of polish that players are looking for tend to get mixed Steam reviews.
So I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Like I was saying before, players just want a polished experience. So they probably should have either gone for like a lower scope with Stormgate so that they weren't biting off more than they can chew and they could get a nice quality game out there. If you go and look at Battle Aces in comparison, that game right now feels like super polished. It may not be the game for you, but I don't think anybody can deny that the game just looks super polished. It feels great to play. Honestly, they could pretty much release the game now, and I wouldn't even know it was a beta or an alpha. I would just consider it to be the full game. It's at that level of polish, but it's also much simpler a game than Stormgate. There are far fewer game modes, there's no campaign, etc, etc. So if we compare these games directly, Battle Aces is a game that has a much narrower scope than Stormgate, and they therefore been able to put the necessary resources and time into making what they do have super polished and nice. I mean, obviously I don't know how successful that game's going to be, but we'll see, I guess, in the future.
I'm going to harken back to, there's a conference that's held generally in February in the US called the DICE Conference. And I remember early in my career attending that conference, and some guys from Blizzard, which I had no idea I would later wind up working at Blizzard. So, was just so excited to see these guys from Blizzard up there on stage because they had made some of the games that I was most excited about growing up, whether it was Warcraft, Starcraft, just, amazing games, Diablo. And so I was eager to hear their advice. And I remember distinctly that the creative director, a guy named Chris Metzen, got up on stage and he said, "Don't release your games before they're ready." And I remember thinking to myself, well, none of us want to release a game before we're ready, but we don't have the same capital resources. We don't have the fire hose of money that World of Warcraft produces to be able to just wait indefinitely until we launch our games. And his advice was good. Definitely for Stormgate, for those other titles that were listed on the prior slide, the thing that hurt the Steam reviews was we had to release our games before they were ready. But the reason that we did that is that we don't have the same resources as Blizzard. And I'm sure many of you in this room can identify with that experience of wishing that you could have another month, another year, another few years to finish your game, but not having the luxury to be able to wait to do that. Certainly, it was my hope that early access would set an expectation with consumers that was forgiving, but big lesson learned, consumers reward polish. And so I think a narrower scope with higher polish would have been more successful. And I definitely think that others, as they look at the outcome in terms of Steam review scores that we got for Stormgate, will probably follow that course. I think we'll see developers hold releases if they can, but definitely I think we'll see developers try to focus on narrower scope, higher polish to get a better review response out of early access.
So that story there coming out of Chris Metzen over at Blizzard is super cool to hear there back in the heyday of Blizzard. You know, when I was a kid growing up, like many of you guys, I bet, I was just the biggest Blizzard fan. Maybe not so much these days, but back then, nobody could beat them for me. Blizzard were the game company. You knew if Blizzard gave out a game, it was going to be amazing. The polish was going to be through the roof. It was going to be probably one of, if not your favorite game for like the next year or two, or maybe even 5 or 10 if it turned out to be StarCraft Brood War. So all the way back then, they knew that you had to release a game when it's ready and polished, otherwise your game is going to be dragged through the mud. So it's kind of interesting that in this day and age, we still see games like Stormgate releasing when they are blatantly not ready. Now, as Tim mentioned, the reason they had to release is because they basically ran out of cash, right? They needed to try and get the cash cow going. But again, it's not really going to benefit you if you know that your game isn't ready, nobody's going to play it, and look at the situation now. I guess it's one thing to say this, looking in hindsight, nobody really knew exactly how the release was going to go, but they're not making any revenue on the game. And honestly, I think they just should have had a narrower scope. They tried to beat StarCraft on all fronts. They tried to make a very similar StarCraft game, but they try to do co-op better than StarCraft. They're trying to do the campaign better than StarCraft. They're trying to do 1v1, multiple 3v3 modes as well, with a much lower budget and a much shorter development time. And that's honestly turned out to be like almost a recipe for disaster. Now, the problem they're having now is they can't just go and cut modes and say, okay, you know, maybe we need to just cut some stuff out of the game, concentrate on making the base foundation of it better, maybe just having like 1v1 and the campaign. It's too late for that. They've already made promises now, and I think the only way forward for them is to get additional investment, spend more time on the game. Honestly, for me, I wish they could almost just take it offline, just take it off of Steam. I know a lot of you will probably dislike me for saying that, but I think that was probably what would be best for the game. Go back to beta testing again and say, okay, we made a mistake, we weren't ready to release the game, let's just go back to the drawing board, put our heads down for a few years, get some additional capital, get some more funding, and try and make the game the one we actually dreamed of, and then do a re-release when it's actually polished and ready. Again, I'm not a game dev, I don't really know anything about this, this is just my core feelings on it.
I think as a developer, having gone through this experience, if I were to do early access again, I mentioned narrower scope, higher polish, but also we would plan for early access to not be a point in time where the game is self-sustaining from revenue, because that has been the outcome, and as a result, we've had to take more investment to be able to continue to polish the game to ultimately get it towards the 1.0 version that we want it to be.
So that right there, for me, was the most important thing that was said in the whole lecture, that they've taken more investment. A lot of us have been sat here thinking, well, if they were forced to release the game in early access to create revenue and keep on funding the game, and that's obviously not happening, then how are they funding the game now? Is the studio going to shut down? Are they going to sunset the game? Like, what is happening with it? And right there, he said he's had to take additional funding. So that is good news. How much is that additional funding? Is it enough to get them to the 1.0 release? Who knows? I really hope that some of these questions are going to be answered during the AMA. But another thing that I've noticed Tim Morton saying many, many times, and he almost goes out of his way to mention this if you watch him in various interviews and lectures and whatnot, is that he talks about Stormgate being Frost Giant's first game. He keeps on saying like, oh, this is our first game, so we're learning a lot of lessons from this, as if he is 100% planning to have a second game, even a third game within Frost Giant Studios. And I think they will learn a lot from Stormgate, even if ultimately the game does end up being a failure and nobody plays it. Who knows, maybe that means their second game will be much more successful, because I do think they are capable of making a game that people want to play. It's just that it wasn't really ready. It just pretty much comes down to that. Maybe there was some mismanaged community expectations as well. Maybe they should have listened to what the community wanted a little bit more too. But I sincerely hope that Frost Giant Studios does keep on ticking.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So just to repeat it for the rest of the room to make sure you heard, there have been games that launch into early access and are then abandoned. And so there is some automatic negative sentiment in the player base around early access because of that. And how do you overcome that? It was interesting that when we were crowdfunding, because we did some crowdfunding late in the process for Stormgate, we talked about being funded to launch, and to us that meant early access launch. And I think it turned out players were really sensitive to knowing that a developer is actually funded to 1.0 launch because of specifically what you're talking about. And so that was a lesson learned for us. I think we since then have tried to be super clear about our status, that we are committed to getting to 1.0, and that we are continuing to make updates to 1.0, but it is about building trust. And I think, again, going back to the funding part of all of this, if I had it to do over again, you know, we would plan in such a way that we could say confidently at the beginning of the process, this game is funded all the way to 1.0 launch, just so that that trust is established up front, because that was a challenge that we had to deal with. So great question. Thank you.
So he's absolutely spot on there that yes, the community was and still is very scared and worried that the game isn't going to have the funding to get it to 1.0 and that Frost Giant Studios may not even exist in a couple of years. And I think this is one of the main reasons that the player count is so low. People don't want to jump in and dedicate time and effort to something that may not exist in the future. This is certainly true for me and my YouTube channel. You guys have probably noticed that I started off with the Stormgate release making guides, build orders, casting lots of games, but the fact of the matter is, there simply isn't really much point making those sorts of videos or that sort of content for a player base that simply doesn't exist. There's only like less than 100 players in the game right now. There really is nobody out there who is interested in learning build orders for Stormgate or strategies for Stormgate, or barely even watching live casted games, which is why I've sort of rolled back to just covering the news about the game, because that is what is receiving the most amount of views, the most amount of attention. The audience at large who are interested in Stormgate, they are not playing the game. They're just keeping an eye on the game, right? So when they see a video like this, you may click on that video and you want to know how the game's doing, what is in the next patch, etc. How is it coming along up to the 1.0 release? And maybe by the time it rolls around to that 1.0 release, then you're going to jump back in with both feet first. But right now, there is definitely this atmosphere of uncertainty around everything. I feel it. I know the whole player base feels it. Again, I don't want to come off as overly negative or anything here, guys. I sincerely hope the best for Stormgate. I hope the best for Frost Giant Games. I really do believe in them, but I feel like we need some information from them, something to sort of put our worries at rest, and hopefully we're going to get some of that key information during the AMA. Right guys, with that said, I'm going to head off. I am absolutely full of a cold, you can probably tell by my voice, so apologies for that. But otherwise, guys, keep your eyes peeled to the channel. I'll be continuing to cover Stormgate going forward. Like I say, I really hope they can pull off the miracle and the player base comes back and I can start making more content in the game. Because if that doesn't happen, this may not only be disastrous for Stormgate and Frost Giant Games, but also just RTS games in general. Like if Zero Space isn't successful, if Battle Aces isn't successful, then you pretty much know that all the publishers and devs out there aren't going to bother touching RTS with a 10-foot pole for the next probably 5 or 10 years before they give it a shot again. So I really am crossing all my fingers and toes. Hope you're doing the same. Otherwise guys, take care, and I'll see you all in the next video.